Welcome back, everybody. Today I'm going to be speaking with Jonathan Hadas Edwards. I think it's probably about, we were just discussing how long it was. I think it's about 18 months, maybe a little bit more or less since we spoke. But originally when I contacted Jonathan, we had a long discussion about his interest in Chinese medicine and Ayurveda and some of the Rasa Shastra, the alchemical works, and his trip to Nepal. So we've sort of obviously just kept in contact in the interim, and Jonathan writes a rather great Substack, which is the Seeds from the World Tree.
No, that's it. It's Seeds from the World Tree. There's different sections on there.
I'd highly recommend Jonathan's Substack. Really, really interesting. And I just noticed as of late, he'd been posting a lot of Jyotish material, and that's of great interest to me. So I thought it'd be great to ask him back on and just maybe just talk a little bit about what he's doing, how he's using it, how he sort of came to it. I know obviously you've got the Ayurveda interest, so that's probably an inroad into that anyway, but maybe you could give us a little bit of background how you got into the Jyotish and how you're using it.
Yeah, absolutely. First of all, great to be back, Andrew. I really appreciate what you're up to in the world and glad to be here. Yeah, actually, it was when I was first studying Ayurveda at the Ayurvedic Institute, which used to be in Albuquerque, New Mexico, Dr. Vasant Lad's institution. That was circa 2007, right after college for me, undergrad. And Dr. Lad would take a look at students' charts and the breaks between the lectures and things. Jyotish was just kind of in the air there, and I kind of caught a whiff of it, and I was curious. I'd never really been interested in astrology, and I'd only just started to get interested in divination in general. I'd learned about the I-ching, and was kind of exploring that on the side just a little bit. Yeah, so I think even before I get into how I got into Jyotish, it makes sense maybe to spend a moment on how I got into divination. I think in a way it's the more interesting story because, how does somebody who grows up in kind of I thought I was going to be a physicist until I was about 20 years old, right? I was very much of a scientific materialist bent, as was kind of the expectation of me in the milieu in which I grew up. So how do you get into divination? It's not like it was presented in a college course catalog or something like that.
Mm.
And I mean, on one level, it started for me in high school with my best friend. He and I would kind of got into flipping coins just on a lark because we were in New York City, had a lot of, relatively a lot of freedom as high schoolers. What do we want to do of a Friday night or on a Saturday night? And we decided, if we came up with a really outlandish possibility that involved taking the subway 2 hours out to the tip of Brooklyn and, going to Coney Island, we were like, well, we want to have a chance of doing that, but we don't want to lock ourselves in to just a yes or no. So we're like, if we get 4 heads in a row on the coin flip, we'll do that. So we kind of started allowing, the hand of fate to have a hand in our evening plans just for fun. And we kind of took it half seriously and said, okay, if we've decided to flip a coin, we've got to follow what the coin flip says. It became like a little informal religion and sort of form of one-upsmanship for us to do that. So it was kind of that idea of allowing randomness to have a say in one's life kind of came in that way. But then, that was just kind of for fun. And then at one point I was living with a good friend who was an English major. And we both had a lot of interesting reading material, and he was a very theatrical guy. And one night we decided we were going to have a little reading, just the two of us. We wanted to kind of share with each other whatever was, interesting us at the time. So we each came into the living room with a stack of books, and we're like, oh, geez, we have, an hour before we want to go out or something like that. We're not going to read 10 books. How are we going to pick one? And I thought, I know, I'll devise a ridiculously elaborate method for choosing what we're going to read. And it involved flipping various coins onto some maps. It was this very kind of convoluted process. So it took us about 5 minutes of flipping coins and, eliminating certain books from the stack until we finally had it down to one book. And I flipped more coins till we got to one page. So through this elaborate random process, we chose a book by Jorge Luis Borges and a story called The Babylon Lottery, which I had never read before. And I proceeded to open the book and read the first sentence of it. And I almost fell off my chair. It was, in fact, I should pull it up here and read the first sentence. Let me look it up. Okay, so the story opens, like all men in Babylon, I have been proconsul. Like all, I have been a slave. I have known omnipotence, ignominy, imprisonment. Look here, my right hand has no index finger. Look here, through this gash in my cape, you can see on my stomach a crimson tattoo. It is the second letter, Beth. On nights when the moon is full, this symbol gives me power over men with the mark of Gimel, but it subjects me to those with the Aleph, who on nights when there is no moon owe obedience to those marked with the Gimel. and then immediately goes on to explain that in the world of this story, everything in society is dictated by this kind of randomized process, this elaborate randomized process, this lottery. And so it was perfectly describing exactly the sort of thing we had just done to pick the story. And it was just such a coincidence that it was kind of like the deity was like winking at us so hard that you couldn't ignore it. It kind of broke my worldview in that moment. I was like,
Mm.
there's no way that's just a coincidence. Like something is messing with me.
I forget who the author was. I think it might have been Robert Anton Wilson. He was saying in one of his books, like Cosmic Trigger or something. He was doing a talk about. He said you could reduce everything in the universe to numbers, and somehow they got onto the subject of number five. And he said I can make anything, any question you have relate to the number five. And of course,
Reduce down to
he sort
five.
of, yeah, just whatever. He would just do it numerologically or
Yeah.
historically or whatever. And you know, they had a good laugh, and everyone was asking lots of questions. Anyway, so the couple came up to him afterwards and said, "Could we continue the conversation over dinner?" And he said, "Sure." And he said, "Let's. There's a restaurant just round the corner. Let's carry on." So they went in there, and the waitress said, "Okay, table for three." And he said, "Yes." And she said, "Oh, table five's
Rule
free."
number five.
so, he said, the more you pay attention to what the cosmos, the more attention it pays to you.
Right.
So it's that kind of interaction. So yeah.
Yeah. I mean, for me now, it's kind of like, well, of course, of course that would happen. But at the time, it's just like something shifted in me, and it was actually it was a bit terrifying because it was challenging my whole paradigm. So I didn't actually do much divination for a while after that, but it kind of opened the door. And then eventually somebody knew I was interested in randomized stuff and Borges, and they handed me a copy of the I-ching, and then one thing led to another from there. And
Mm.
then it was a couple of years after that at the Ayurvedic Institute that I got into Jyotish. But Jyotish was, I guess what happened is I decided let's buy a book, and I bought Light on Life, Heart
Mm.
Defoe.
It's sort of fairly complicated book. I mean, maybe not the ideal best first, but a nice introductory.
I like jumping in the deep end with things, I guess. And I mean that, yeah, the book doesn't assume any background. It gives you all the context you need, but it takes you pretty deep. I mean, I'm only now in my studies kind of getting to the point where everything in that book is familiar and makes, it's like I don't have too many more questions about anything presented in that book now, but it's taken me a number of years to get to that point. That's like a 4-year course in one book. So I chewed on that for a while, and found that there was plenty of meat on that bone. Um, and actually, I was in a Mercury bhukti of Saturn Mahadasha at the time, so I was in a Mercury sub period, and it makes sense given given what's going on in my own chart, that Mercury is very constellated with the second house, the eighth house. It's the eighth lord aspecting back into the eighth house. It's very much involved with astrology, and Mercury also being the karaka for astrology as well. So it was kind of bringing in that theme, but it was only a book that only lasted a couple of years, 2 or 3 years, and my life was focused on other things. It kind of fell to the wayside. I kept the book, but I didn't really think about it much. I was just in the beginning of Saturn Dasha with other fish to fry and other karma to fulfill. And then as it happened, when Saturn ended in circa 2000, I guess 22, and I went into Mercury, it's like Jyotish came roaring back. It's just like one day it kind of popped into my head, just seemingly out of nowhere. I went looking for podcasts on the topic, thinking, oh, maybe I can find something to listen to. And I found a podcast by this guy, Ben Collins, who runs puja.net, one of these puja and yagya services based in South India. I think he's there part of the time, and you can sign up for the yagyas and participate remotely in these elaborate yagyas that he sponsors through the organization. And he was interviewing primarily a woman named Penny Farrow on his Jyotish Conversations podcast, which I recommend. It was these 30, 40-minute episodes, about 20 of them, where
Mhm.
he would interview Penny and one or two other Jyotishis at times, but she was the main interviewee. And I just thought, this woman really knows her stuff. She's sharp. She's good. And I look, and actually her name rang a bell. Somebody in the Ayurvedic Institute days had mentioned her, and it turned out she was a student of Hart Defoe who had written Light on Life. So it all felt like the same lineage I was kind of exposed to already. And Penny had a website that was pretty low profile, somewhere almost like in fine print. She mentioned doing some teaching or offering some classes. It almost felt like this kind of incognito mystery school that I stumbled my way into. She's like, oh, well, as it happens, we're welcoming a new cohort. Why don't first, there was kind of a little bit of a minor vetting process of having a call with her, making, the teacher making sure the students seemed like their heart was in the right place and such. And then
Mm,
she was like, well, if you'd like to join, we're starting a new cohort. And all of a sudden it was just like it was on. I was taking her basics series, which everybody goes through no matter how much background they have, to make sure everybody's got the same ABCs and understands how to calculate. It's like she's found over time that you really want to make sure everybody has the same foundation, and it's worth putting people through that. But people who have a little more background can jump in with more advanced classes alongside. So I was just taking as much as I could stomach very quickly, and that's okay. And I'm still taking classes through that sangha. It's Penny is one of the main teachers, a woman named Claudia Anfuso, Purushottam Dabasya. It's all students of Heart Defoe, basically.
mm.
Very much Parashari, Jyotish. I mean, people learn some Jaimini and other things, but the core of the training is very much Parashari. Seems like down the middle, very canonical,
Mm.
classical English.
So you had no prior, no Western influence at all. It was literally just dive straight into the.
Astrology never really clicked for me for some reason. I was always kind of interested in astrology a little bit, but something I never found a teacher for Western or a book that really opened it up for me. And Jyotish has always been more my orientation to it. So I guess unlike a lot of Westerners, I haven't had to like feel like I'm unlearning anything or, or anything like
Mm.
that.
I
Jyotish.
always think that's a big advantage. I mean, that for me, that's the same thing. I never really, of course, you know your sun sign and you look at the papers and stuff like that. But I was never interested in studying it. And then it just came up during the Ayurvedic studies because quite often they'll talk about, oh, you should pick this herb under this particular nakshatra or something like that, or that during this month, this is when you'll see more diseases come. And it talks about the stars connected to the month. So I just thought it'd be interesting to get an inroad. And a bit like you, once you start reading it, you think actually this is quite practical. It's actually got really practical application, and that sort of draws you into the. I think I did the same as you. I think the first book I read was like Light on Life. So you can imagine like completely being devoid of any background and then just jumping in. I think the first thing was just understanding what I was looking at, this North Indian chart, and kind of deciding I couldn't quite understand how it was working, and then it sort of fell into place as I read the book. But like you, it takes about 4 or 5 goes through that book. There's a hell of a lot of information in there. It's a great book, a fantastic reference material, but maybe not the best one to start with.
Light reading for sure. It's definitely a textbook. Yeah.
So how long were you, so you've been doing that since the pandemic, so what, 2022 you
I
started?
really, yeah, I mean, I had that foundation from years ago, but I really only jumped in earnest like at the end of 2022.
Yeah.
So I'm relatively fresh to all this. I feel like I'm a relatively quick study as well, and I've really gone pretty hard into the studies, but there's tons to learn. The ocean of Jyotisha is vast, and I guess even a lifetime isn't enough to cross it. So I'm
Yeah,
still
not
close to the
remotely.
shoreline.
And then are
Yeah.
you introduced to all the class? Do they kind of that teaching method? Are they getting you to read the classics, or is it more about interpreting charts? What's the approach that they use? Is it very much a sort of traditional training, or is it more you're listening to the teacher explaining, how to read a chart?
It's all rooted in the classics. We've been instructed to buy, Parashara and Varahamira and a couple of classics, and occasionally, it's not like we have reading assignments in the classics, but the classes will often quote the classics. It's very much rooted in, but it's also a lineage tradition which has, also some differences with things that, are only in the oral tradition, things like Kalasarpa yoga, which aren't mentioned in the classics, or um, so it's like my Chinese medicine training in that it clearly has roots in the classics, but it's also there's this trunk of the tree which comes out of that ground and grows. I don't know
Mm,
if that's quite the right metaphor, but it's, yeah, classically rooted, I would say.
mm. And how did you find sort of reading? I mean, obviously you're used to reading stuff like that with the Chinese and the Ayurvedic text anyway. Did you find it because the sort of Indian translations can be sort of a bit challenging sometimes to pick your way through.
Gotta have a teacher for this stuff. You just do. Anybody who tries to teach himself from the classics, whether they're Indian or anywhere else, they're not designed to be used without the key that a guru gives. And coming back to the, Jyotish versus Western astrology, it's not that I'm opposed to Western astrology, but I think one of the real outstanding differences for me in my experience with Jyotisha is that it is a living tradition, and there's a teacher to student transmission that happens. There's this unbroken lineage where things get transmitted and passed down. And it's like Western astrology, it seems like that lineage was broken at a certain point in the Middle Ages or sometime or whenever it was, maybe different times in different places. But it's kind of this reconstruction that's going on. But
Mm.
it's as if like sometimes it feels like there's not as much power in the line or something like
Mm.
that. It's like the plumbing is being repaired, but I don't know if the water's been turned on or something like that. I mean, maybe
Mm.
just certain lineages or something like that. And
Mm.
I'm sure there's exceptions to that in the Western astrology world as well. But
Is it like a group that's doing it, or is it sort of one-to-one? I think you said was it a group
yeah,
that?
it's a group classes. If anybody's curious or looking for a Jyotish teacher, they welcome new students about twice a year. It's called the Cosmic Kaleidoscope is the name of the Sangha. You can go to the cosmickaleidoscope.com. There's a proper website for the classes now. It's not quite so incognito as it was.
Mm. Okay. What's your main interest in use? Are you more interested in using it as a form of you're interested in predicting future events, or is it more kind of like health inspired, or like your Mahertas, for timing? Well, what's your kind, or is it just all of it? I mean, is there any interest that?
Right now, it's a bit of a smorgasbord. I mean, I certainly use it in my own life for, understanding one's own chart is so fundamental and such a rabbit hole in some ways. So that's where it starts, natally. But I'm interested in the other limbs of Jyotish as well. I do a lot of prashna. I find it a very useful, lens. Or I'll do a consult chart for a patient who's coming for acupuncture or herbs. Either when they first reach out to me, I'll cast a chart for that time, or I'll cast a chart for the time of their first visit, just to gain a little more context around what their constitution might be like, what kind of just what their settings might be, and just helpful context for things that might not show up in the pulse or the tongue or whatever else. Yeah, I've been interested in, of course, in divination and in medicine and the ways that these two things inform one another. And there's a couple things to say here, I think. One is about the relationship of medicine and divination more broadly. And this is a little bit abstract or philosophical, maybe, but for a while, I was noting the analogies between a ritual process like divination and divination is a ritual call that always generally asks for a response, just like in medicine you have a diagnosis which calls for a treatment. It's very much a call and response format, which is so I was kind of, for a while I was thinking, oh, divination's analogous to medicine. They both have a process of some sort of assessment, whether you call it a reading or whether you call it, going to an MRI machine. They both have their kind of specialists, their priests, their white coated clergy in the
Mm.
medical world, and then they have their interventions, whether it's a bottle of pills or whether it's a mantra or whatever it may be, you know. So I was noting the kind of analogies between the two. And this is maybe a bit odd or a bit radical, but it occurred to me that maybe it's actually the case that what we know of as medicine is more a special case of divination than the other way around. I think in a sense, divination and ritual are the larger umbrella here, and what's become very normalized in our culture as mainstream medicine and treatment is kind of a special case of that.
Mm.
It's in our very narrow life experience and very particular point in history, it's become the norm, and all this other stuff has been pushed to the margin. But in the larger context, it's just another form of divination.
Mm.
You know, we trust these X-rays, and for somebody from another culture and another time and place, it would seem just as esoteric and odd as any other form of divination that we think is. So that just kind of recontextualized things for me. Another place where I've been exploring over the last, I don't know, decade or so is how to work with, because divination is essentially a symbolic output. You can think of it as like you're receiving symbolic information through whatever divination method. But I sort of thought, how, and medicine is essentially an input of information into the system, right? Whether it's with a vaccine or whether it's with a pill or whether it's with an acupuncture needle. I can needle the fire point on somebody's earth channel and supplement the fire point, and that's going to, because fire feeds earth and the elemental cycle, that's going to increase it's going to strengthen that earth organ. It's an input of symbolic information. And
Mm.
if that sounds kind of abstract, somebody typing in some nuclear launch codes is also an input of symbolic information. These things can have very potent effect. So it doesn't, it may sound, oh, it's just a bunch of symbols. No, symbols are what the world runs on. Language is symbols, ideas, it's all symbols. So I don't mean that in a denigrating way at all. But I sort of thought, I was experimenting with medical divination, and I do a cast for somebody, I receive that symbolic information, and then I do my treatment, which is also an inputting of symbolic information. Well, what if I close the loop in a sense and input hexagram, the same exact form of information that comes out of an i-ching divination directly into their system? There's lots of ways to input information via an acupuncture needle, but as far as I know, there's no way to input the 64 hexagrams of the i-ching in a direct one-to-one way. But that would be interesting if there were, wouldn't there? So I came up with a way to sort of map the 64 hexagrams in a very natural geometry, which turns out to be a circle of circles, which basically reflects the toroidal structure of that system. And the 8 rings of 8 points each, totals are 64 hexagrams, and that can be mapped onto the scalp. It can be mapped onto the abdomen. I usually needle these points on the abdomen. Becomes an acupuncture microsystem, of which there are many. There's hand acupuncture, there's scalp acupuncture. There's the whole point of acupuncture, in a sense, is that every part mirrors the whole. So it's very normal to map an entire thing onto one part of the body, just like in palmistry, the hand reflects the whole, etc. So I started playing with inputting hexagrams into the system through this microsystem, and have had some interesting experiences with it. I feel like as a practitioner, I've only explored it so much because there's only so much leeway you have for doing something that's more experimental when people are coming to you for help. I don't feel like people primarily want to be guinea pigs. So I've occasionally gotten consent from people to do something a little bit more exploratory. But really what I'd like to do is put this system out there, maybe write an article about it and see what other people can make of it. But I think there's interesting explorations to be done.
You're unusual in that you're doing a lot of mainstay Chinese. I hate to use the word sort of traditional Chinese man. I always sort of call it classical Chinese, because I guess that's what you're interested in rather than the sort of the later stuff. But yeah, sort of classical Chinese medicine and its roots with its own astrological system. And then you've got Ayurveda on that side, which has obviously got Jyotish. So did you find at some point you were a bit torn and think, actually, I'm already an accomplished acupuncturist, maybe I should better learn the Chinese system and try and understand their astrology? Or
I know you would think so, and it's not that I'm uninterested in it. It's just kind of the way things work. I never really found a teacher for Batsa or any of the other Chinese astrology at the moment when I would have been ripe for it. And in a way, Ayurveda and engagement in Indian traditions is kind of the deeper layer for me. It's what I started with first before I got diverted into Chinese medicine. So it almost feels like you're coming full circle. But I'm 40 whatever years old. There's time to learn more things. We'll see. I don't know. I don't have that clear of a sense of the lay of the land of Chinese astrology, but I know that there's multiple astrological systems in China, which may have very little to do with each other. There's something called pole star astrology, which is being transmitted in the States and in the West partly through a guy, the late Lu Ming, kind of popularized that. Some of his students are teaching and practicing that, and that's somewhat of a familiar system in that at least there are 12 houses, so it's somewhat but then there's Batsa, which is the 8 pillars. You're a wood rat is one. There's we all know that we're year of the tiger or whatever it is, but there's also there's the day, the month, the year, etc. So there's 4 of these, and each one has 2. So there's a total of 8 pieces of information. It's not just year of the tiger or something like that. And how do all those things interact and interplay? It gets into the 5 elements, but all of that is without reference really to the stars per se or to the houses. So it's a whole different approach. There's medical approaches where there's actually a Korean style called Sasang medicine, Korean constitutional medicine, where they look at your Batsa chart, they look at your 8 pillars, and they look at the elemental balance and what's going on with those, and then they prescribe you herbs and diet entirely based on that, without ever necessarily even asking about your symptoms or taking your pulse or doing any of the normal medical things. It goes straight from astrology to treatment. And generally it's either, this is my rudimentary understanding of the system, but it's basically either you get an all-warming diet and you're supposed to avoid all cooling foods, or vice versa.
Right. Wow.
At one point I thought, oh, well, my interest started from my time in Nepal, maybe, I have this connection to the Himalayan region. Maybe at some point I'll want to learn Tibetan medicine. And at this point in my life, I'm kind of like, I don't know that I really want to start over with Tibetan medicine. I mean, it's a beautiful, incredible system, and I'm fascinated by the herbal formulas, which use all these plants that I don't know from the high Himalayas and the Himalayan plateau, and seem to work extremely well.
Mm.
But do I want to start over with another medical system and and another language? Not right now, not today. I did study Muhurta about a year ago, and I've definitely embraced that, although it makes the obsessive compulsive one in me has to remember not to try to do a Muhurta for every little thing. And
Yeah,
then sometimes, like today, pick a Muhurta and then there's a technical difficulty, and you may or may not actually catch it. So life happens, right? But I've found Muhurta to be quite remarkable. At times it's really shown its magic. So, I guess I'm a believer.
Prajna is good like that. I mean, I had a friend about a year ago, he moved into a new property, and overall it was a good chart, but it wasn't without issues, and it had a lot of stuff around breakages, hidden damage, and that turned out to be. And at the time, he was just saying, "Oh no, there's just no way that's going to happen." And I've been over the house; it's been surveyed, and it's all fine. And then afterwards, once he got in, he started finding all these things where they sort of done quick fixes just to cover things up, and it turned out it was a lot more complex. In the end, it was actually quite an accurate chart, and there was a real thing around the delay of the actual getting in. That was a problem. He had, there was a problem actually getting into the property. Somebody was, I wouldn't say it was a squatter, but somebody was like refusing to go, who had tenuous rights to be there, and it took a little bit of persuasion to have them move. But luckily, again, referring back to this Prajna, we saw a possible answer for that, and he implemented that, and it did actually work. So, I mean, I guess you could argue that maybe it was just all, all in our own imagination, but I mean, it seemed to be accurate for me. When I looked at the Prajna and looked at the events, I thought it pretty much described the actual events themselves. So I was happy with it. I thought it was a good technique, and because it's based on questioning for the now, for the moment they asked the question, at least we know there was a very accurate time. Whereas birth times can often be an issue, or if people don't know their birth time and stuff like that, that can be more of an issue.
Absolutely. I mean, the reason that we're ultimately interested in this stuff is because it does work. And sometimes it's startling still, even as somebody who quote unquote believes, not that it exactly requires belief, but it can be incredibly effective. And I think it's still, as somebody who grew up in such a different worldview in New York City, scientific materialist kind of settings, it's still kind of mind blowing at times that it's possible that the heavens at any given moment will intimately reflect what's going on for us personally and globally, and it just requires a completely different understanding of reality, which we may or may not fully inhabit at any one time.
So how are you encouraged to work with this? So does the school give you any background in sort of calculation, or are they actually just saying basically just go with the software? I mean, I know I've tried to calculate things by hand and I can do it, but it's a hell of a job, and there are so many things you have to be aware of to build into the calculation. So of course it's so much easier just to use software.
Yeah, so the Cosmic Kaleidoscope Sangha, all the classes are besides the basic series, which is required. All the other classes are sort of modular, so you can kind of add, 4 weeks of this, or 6 weeks of that, or 12 weeks of the other. You can kind of piece them together how you want. Although there's certain prerequisites for other things, and there is I don't know if it's an 8 or a 10 or 12-week class, which is all about how to calculate the chart by hand. I haven't taken it yet, but it would be a good thing to know. At least once in your life to do it by hand. I mean, I imagine with an ephemeris and things, you could figure it out. But I haven't taken that particular class. We all mostly are using software. The software that's mostly recommended by my teachers is Sri Jyotish, Andrew Foss's software. I, not being especially technically proficient with software and running a Mac, that I found it a nightmare to try to run the simulator or whatever to run the PC software on a Mac. I gave it a try and I was just like, this is I'm not going to do this on a daily basis. This is
Does he give you the option to try it first, and or you haven't got to buy it, and then can you try then buy, or is it buy then try?
I don't remember. What I did buy was some sort of simulator or something that allowed you to convert it. And then I think I maybe just had a subscription version or something like that I was able to cancel. But whatever it was, it didn't work out for me. I love the way Sri Jyoti Star charts show up because the planets are all colored in, so you kind of get the immediate at a glance. You can see what's what without really even focusing your eyes because Mars is red and Saturn's blue, and it's helpful to see that, you know. But I use a different software platform called Deva.guru.
So you can sort of just use it, can't you? But it's limited what you get access to. But
Can't remember if there's a totally free version. There's definitely a $9 a year version, so less than $1 a month. And then there's a $9 a month version, which is what I use, which gives you access to a lot more divisional charts and things like that.
mm,
It's run by or created by students of Pandit Sanjay Rath,
mm,
who has his own lineage style based from Orissa and Eastern India. So that's a very different lineage from mine, and there's plenty of divisional charts and features in that software that I don't use because it's not part of the lineage that I'm training in. But it has basically everything I need. There's one divisional chart that's important in our lineage that is not available in that software. So I just wrote to them, and they're going to add it in.
right. What's that? Just out of interest.
It's one of the D11s. It's the Tajika D11 chart, which has got a bizarre kind of
Ekadashamsha or something like that, is it? It's Ekadashamsha or the D.
yeah, but there's Ekadashamsha, but there's a couple different Ekadashamshas, and this is the Iyer.
Yeah,
It's a Tajika chart that Iyer used a lot, and Iyer is my understanding of Iyer is that he was I think first half of 20th century South Indian Jyotishi, really brilliant guy
yeah.
who worked to integrate a lot of Panchang and solar lunar Jyotish with natal astrology and ended up with kind of coming up with these principles that are not, they're rooted in the classics, but they're not anything that's directly referred to. They're kind of apurvata in that sense. But they really stood the test of time. And I think my teacher's teacher, Hart Defoe, and his teacher, Mantriji, K.L. Mantri was his guru. He came from India, moved to Toronto, where they met. And they came across, I think Hart came across Iyer's work, showed it to Mantri, and Mantri took some time, digested it, and said, yes, this is good. So basically, it's like another stream that became incorporated into the lineage sometime in the 70s or 80s, something like that, I believe. And it's basically a methodology for working with the divisional charts in a different way than is done elsewhere. So that's my main toolkit for the divisional charts is Iyer's work.
Just given this example, what would be special for you about the D11 that would have really stood out?
Right, that particular D11 he looks at as like a very important chart for money, career, awards, any kind of like it's a major chart for money, easy money, investments, all sorts of big successes and major ventures you'd read from that chart. So it's an important one, and it just has a different allocation scheme. If you look up a different D11, the placements will be different from the Tajika one. So you just have to make sure you're calculating the right D11 to use for those purposes. But Iyer's methodology is all about looking at what the Bhukti Lord and the Dasha Lord are doing in the divisional chart. That's what you're paying attention to essentially. And there's different, but it's quite complex. There's a whole different set of yogas that don't exist in the natal chart that either.
I don't doubt its complexity for a minute. I mean, that's the thing with a lot of these softwares. I did run Sri Jyoti for a while. I kind of use Kala most of the time now, just that I really like the simplicity of it. I mean, it's not a simplistic program. It's a highly technical program. There's many things, but it's got a kind of a base that really works for me because it's all squares and I can just click on a square and show what I want in that square. It's very easy to set up. A lot of there's a good auto function in there which helps you set it up. So if you're a bit of a technophobe and you don't want to spend too much time setting it up, you can just use all the recommendations. So there are a few options in there, but the particularly with the divisionals, there's some nice individual screens that you can set up for that. And again, like you were saying, I think Ernst gives you all it'll say in brackets at the end Aya, so they give you a couple of different versions like the D10 or something like that, or maybe D11. I mean, I don't use a huge amount of those divisionals anyway, but yeah, it's kind of all in there. It's a good piece of software. But basically, I think they're all pretty good. I mean, Parashara as I've heard, is very good. A lot of people like that. I've been using Jyotish Tools Pro. Again, it's sort of a bit of a wolf in sheep's clothing. It sort of looks simple, but it can do a lot of things. It's actually quite powerful, and hoping to maybe speak to the developer of that in the near future. But that's a great one for a phone. If you're just kind of in the, in the office, somebody comes in and asks a question, you've got a Mahercha and a Prajna screen on there, and it's just very, very quick and clean, and you can set a lot of presets can be set up to exactly as you like it. So
Well, Jyotish tours or tools?
Jyotish Tools Pro, yeah, it's a nice piece of software to promote. It's very low cost. I mean, it's like $15, something like that. The desktop one you have to pay for separately, but again, that's got a lot of power. I think they're both for Mac and PC. I think he's got versions for both. So for you, that might be of extra interest. But other than that, yeah, I mean, I think they're all pretty much of a
Yeah,
much.
we're just so lucky to have software these days. Imagine calculating every chart for every prashna, every muhurta, everything. It would just be,
Absolutely. Yeah, yeah. Well, this is when I was in Sri Lanka and I was trying to go around all the Jyotish people I could find. Nearly everybody would just revert to palmistry. That's why palmistry is so popular, because you don't need any software to calculate. And they said, "Oh, no point. It's all in the hand anyway." I think lately I've just drifted back into palmistry again. I don't know why. It just came up, and I interviewed a few people, and I've done quite a lot of interviews lately with people, of the
I've
Western.
noticed. Yeah.
And it's quite amazing to hear this, how people are working with it. So I guess that's something. I think Hart Defoe's he's got quite a background in palmistry as
Yeah,
well.
and he does, and I'm about to take my first Hasta class and starting next week. So I'm about to dive into that as well with one of his students. It's its own kind of track of study within the larger kind of university, if you will, of the Sangha. Yeah.
Mm. Yeah, not easy, not so easy to find. Although I could find plenty of Western hand readers or chorologists, that could do a talk. It wasn't easy to find many people that could do a talk on the more Vedic tradition. I spoke to Vernon Mahabal and Dr. Sulabh Jain. They're two sort of fairly prominent online Vedic hand readers, and that was quite interesting. They were again very different the way they approached the subject. So, but it's quite fascinating that.
Have you read a series of detective novels by a guy called Alan Anand, the New Age Noir series? He's
Yeah.
a student of Hearts as well, and he's written some technical Jyotisha books, and he's written some other non-astrological stuff. But I definitely recommend this series. Starts with a book called the second one is called Felonious Monk. The first one is blanking on the title, but the New Age Noir is the series, and it's basically the protagonist is a Jyotishi and palmist private investigator. So it's Sherlock Holmes with a horoscope sort of thing.
Wow.
It's
So
it's,
he's
it's
managed to
very
work in all of his knowledge of Jyotish into the story.
exactly
So can
exactly.
you learn? Are you inadvertently learning Jyotish while you're reading this detective novel?
Even somebody with a few years of Jyotish under my belt, I'm definitely picking things up. I'm like, oh, that's actually a really smart way to just the way because Alan himself has decades of experience and as an advanced student longtime student of Hearts, so I can kind of trust that what he's putting in there is valid. And yeah, the way that the protagonist kind of weaves together natal horoscopes, event charts with kind of omens, and just the fluidity with which he puts these different aspects of the tradition together, numerology. Yeah, I mean, maybe Alan's taking some liberties here or there, but it seems to me like it's a pretty high level example of pretty high level practice. That's
Mm.
yeah, it's very fun.
Oh, interesting. Okay, well, I'll put some links up for that, and people can follow that particular thread if they wish. How about sort of what are you kind of what's your main what are you doing with it at the moment? What's your main? Are you seeing people for readings, or are you?
I do natal readings. I'm interested in. I seem to lean, at least at the moment, more towards sort of money and career type focus things as opposed to relationships and love and which as they say, it's either the money or the honey, right? It's it's
It's all
it's
the same. So.
or maybe they have a health question, but it's usually either what should I do with my life, what's going on with my job, or what's up with relationships. So there's a lot of that seems to be 80% of what walks through the door, or both, oftentimes both. But yeah, for whatever reason, I seem to have more affinity right now. Maybe I just have better tools for addressing the money and career side of things. And I really enjoy putting on those particular lenses and working with that side of things. Um, I would like to move more into um, kind of business consulting and strategy at a certain point as well, because I think it's such a practical tool for anybody who's got a small business to understand the natal chart of their business and their own chart as it relates to, and to be able to use prashna and muhurta strategically. I just think it gives you such a leg up to not be trying to, swim upstream.
It's quite funny as you were talking about that. The sun's got was just you're talking about 10th house, and the sun's getting brighter and brighter behind you. So it's obviously your thing. You've been haloed there with that.
A good omen, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, I found it's quite good for. I'm using it mostly Ayurvedically for dosha and the medical in like constitutional analysis. So I'm not really doing a lot of predictive work with it. I mean, my use for it is very limited. Like we were talking about software. If we said that 100% of the software was the capability, I'm probably using like 5% of the software's capability. There's a lot of stuff in there. I've got no idea what it does. And I'm always interested to like you to watch YouTube people talking about. I'll just log on and listen to somebody talking about a technique, and yeah, it's quite interesting. But I don't necessarily use them. I'd sort of got a little bit more interested in solar returns lately. I don't know why. It just became a bit more interesting, and I read a book on it, and it made a lot of sense. But is that something you've looked at, or
Like Varshafal
yeah,
sort of stuff.
Rashapal, yeah.
Yeah, I have a book on that, and I think one of my teachers is going to be offering a class on it at some point. I cracked the book and read it through, and I was like, this is another thing you need a teacher for, because it's from the Tajika tradition and it's quite different from Parashari Jyotisha. And I was like, this requires a teacher to really come to life for me. So
Mm.
it's on the to the side right now. It'll probably at some point it'll be a topic that I jump into, but.
Yeah, I mean, again, it's not. I'm not dedicating my life to it, but I got Dr. Charak's book. He did a book on, which is I
Yeah.
recommend that for a good
Yeah, that's the
introductory.
one. That's the one I've got too.
Yeah, it's a good introductory, and just got me kind of interested in it. And Carla has a screen which is dedicated for that. So if you pull down the menu, there's a Mahurta screen, there's a Prajna screen, there's a Varsha file. So you can, when you click on that, it automatically sets everything up you should need on the screen. But you can customize if there's something extra you want in there. But you get that general toolbox. It's like pulling the right drawer out in the toolbox and having all the right spanners.
Try to have a discipline which I fall off again and then get back on the horse of, starting the day by looking at the chart for the day and just tracking where the planets are, just kind of as a discipline and a mental training piece. And then I'm in, Jyotish classes probably 3 days a week or something like that online. So I'm engaging with it that way. And then I might do, one or two consults in a week, one or two readings for folks. So I'm usually every day I'm either giving a reading or preparing for one or taking a class or something. So yeah, it's a pretty active current in my life.
Would you combine that with other things? So if you say, look, looking from the chart, there may be I see an option to do like a puja for this, or there could be some like talisman or amulet. Is that any of that side of it, like the propitiation for grahas? Is that anything you're
I
into?
generally, for most readings, I have a section of recommendations, and depending on what's going on and depending on the person and their background, that may include anything from Vedic ritual or yagas they could do via whatever channels, or just more kind of all the world of upaya is so broad. There's so many different things. I try to tailor it to what's going to make sense for the person and their life, but it can include very esoteric things. It can include very practical things. Um, some of it's ritual based, some of it's not ritualistic at all, because again, depending on the situation, depending on the person.
Mm.
But I always include, kind of recommendations or actions that the person can take to better align themselves with the
Anything you
current.
found to be particularly like you? I mean, are you kind of more like a mantra man, or are you more like a yagya, or more like gemstones? I mean, anything.
Yeah, well, yeah. Speaking of gemstones, I mean they're fascinating and they're potent, and I've learned to approach them with respect and with a certain amount of caution. I mean, first of all, of course, quality is hugely important. If you get a poor quality gemstone, even if it's well chosen for the planets in your chart, it's going to have some untoward effects and side effects. Even well chosen high quality gemstones can have side effects because, say, the planet owns your ninth house, but it also owns your sixth house. Then, by amplifying it, you may amplify some sixth house themes, even though it's the lord of perhaps one of the most positive houses in the chart, in the ninth. So these things can always have, some side effects. Also, the karaka nature of the planets. Jupiter is the great benefic, and say he owns your 10th and your first house for a Sagittarius, for a Pisces rising. Well, Jupiter is still a karaka for bigness, for he tends to be expansive. And I've known people who go into Jupiter Dasha and they put on 10 or 15 pounds, which
Mm.
isn't, maybe that's not a problem at all, but maybe it's not what the person was looking for. And maybe the gemstone might amplify that effect further. So there's always some room for caution and humility with the stones, but they can be so powerful. Um, at one point, I'm a Scorpio rising. Moon rules my ninth house. It's kind of a newish moon. It's not the strongest moon. I thought, oh, a pearl could be nice for me. Let me try a pearl out, and I got one from a place that sells high quality stones, and will actually ship them to you to kind of test out, and you can ship them back if it doesn't work out. Just an unset stone for you to just
Mm.
to keep in your vicinity or put in your pocket for a few days and try it. And I got the pearl. I opened the package one evening. It was in a little plastic baggie, and I didn't even, I may have taken it out to look at it, but it was back in its baggie, not making contact with my skin or anything. It was in my pocket, and within about an hour, I started to feel altered. And I'm a normally pretty kind of dry, heady person, and I started to feel so watery in this way that was very unfamiliar. I kind of entered an almost like intuitive, creative trance state, and I sat there very contentedly writing what became like nonsense poetry, almost like Edward Lear style nonsense poetry. And I've written poetry in the past, but I've never written like pure nonsense like that. And it was like the most delightful nonsense. And then it was like, okay, I think it's time for bed. And I laid there in bed. I remember just feeling like I was like, oh, like my whole life I've been like a dry sponge, and I feel like I'm being rehydrated on some like soul level. I just felt like this emotional fullness that's just so unfamiliar to me as somebody with a new moon, and it felt amazing. It felt incredibly good, but it was almost like, well, it felt great, and I fell asleep, and I woke up in the morning, and it was like the hydrating kaphagenic process had only continued, and I was becoming like completely waterlogged, and I was getting congested. I got like very bad sinus congestion, but when you're trying on a gemstone, you're saying whatever happens, synchronistically is connected. And the fact that I got so congested, even normally when I get sick, I'm not that prone to sinus congestion like that. But it was very much like that's the nature of a pearl. It's very kapha. And for
Mm.
my system, it seemed to be both a welcome thing and kind of too much of a good thing, so I ended up returning the pearl.
I guess probably for me, I mean, I used a Mercury would probably be quite a strong planet for my based on my chart. So I did use a peridot for a while. I didn't get an emerald. I used peridot, which I bought in Sri Lanka. It was particularly nice stone, and it's quite easy to get there. I mean, that's the one thing about Sri Lanka. I mean, it's the island of gemstones. So literally,
Right.
there's just so much access to gems, and most of them are good quality as well. And the government will test them all for free. You can walk into any government-approved seller, and they'll just do a free gem test to tell you if it's been heated or
Oh
messed
yeah.
with or something.
Mm.
And I can't say I had a huge amount of benefit from it. I mean, difficult. Subjective, isn't it? It's difficult to say whether it was really making a huge difference or not. But what I did find was quite good was they use a lot of yantras, and they
Mm.
have these little sarayas, these little tubes that they wear. So you roll, they write something on a piece of copper, and then it's sort of coated in oil, it's rolled, and then it goes inside this little saraya, and you wear that. But that is only good for a certain amount of time, depending
Mm.
on, they have like a shelf life, if you like. You have
Ah,
to get them recharged or re-energized. But I found that to be more, I felt better with that. I can't say it was more effective, but I felt better with it.
yeah, that's fascinating. I'm interested in all of that, the talisman, amulet making sort of traditions, and then with the stones too. There's something very personal about it. One yellow sapphire could work great for somebody, and a different one might not. Each one has its own some little something to it, and there's something mysterious about it, I would say.
Mhm.
Some of my teachers say that the uparatna, the secondary gemstones, are not, they're not mentioned in Shastra, and they're not really effective. They're not recommended. Other people don't seem to have that view.
Hmm.
Um, but you might have a different experience with an
Trying to
actual.
think, I mean, probably the alchemical literature, I think they'll give a secondary. So, they do mention things like turquoise and lapis, sunstone, moonstone, definitely.
Yeah.
And in association with planets as well. But As for actual gemstone recommendations, I mean, if you go to most Indian astrologers, they'll try to sell you a primary gemstone, which can get quite
Sure.
expensive. But
Personally, I'd rather have a secondary one of high quality than a primary one of questionable quality.
yeah,
Yeah.
that was always my feeling. I think I'd rather get a good quality secondary rather than a duff
Right.
primary one. 'Cause they can get really expensive. I mean, even a nice piece of red coral is not cheap, and
Right.
a good quality pearl. So I certainly red coral is an excellent rasa. I mean, I could say that wholeheartedly. If you've got any kind of blood conditions, any pitta disorders,
Mm,
muscular sinews, red coral is like hyper effective. It's really amazing stuff. So
mm.
certainly taken internally, I could sort of say yes, definite benefit. I mean, I've tried a lot of the gemstone bhashmas. I don't know. Have you tried any or experimented with any of
A
those?
little bit when I was living in Nepal, but not extensively.
Mm.
Yeah. I still have a few that I brought home from an alchemist that I was hanging out with a little bit over there. I have some Shankar Basma that I gave somebody recently. Yeah.
Yeah, I could maybe say more on that than I could on the actual efficacy of the actual gems themselves. But sure, it's a good upaya, and I would not recommend them. I think they have their place. It's just not something that's particularly
Right.
of fascination for me. I don't, you know, a lot of astrologers, you go and see them, and the first words out of their mouth is, "Oh, you need to wear a ruby or
Mm.
you need an emerald or something like that." I don't tend to do that unless somebody specifically says, "Look, I really want a nice stone to wear." But
Yeah, yeah, it's one tool in the kit. I'll tend to at least mention if you're interested in a gemstone, or if you find yourself drawn to gemstones in general, I would avoid X or Y, favor, yellow and red stones for your chart or something like that. And if they have questions and show interest, then we'll get more into it. But I'll just kind of leave a little something like that hanging in case they're curious about that.
I had an interesting encounter in Sri Lanka with one of the doctors at the hospital where I was working. He actually owned a gem mine, and he said, "Why don't you just come one weekend and I'll take you to the mine?" And you know, you have this mental image of what a mine is, but in Sri Lanka, they literally are just a hole in the ground. They literally just dig a vertical shaft and then they go off at right angles, and it's quite often on the level with a local river. You know, because obviously these are placer deposits. It's where old rivers have run and shifted, and as it's been
Mm,
washed down from the mountain, you get this gem gravel. So they have to locate where these previous positions of the river have been, and they do it with a rod. They have like an iron rod that they ram into the ground, and you scratch the rod deliberately, and by looking at the end and the type of scratches you've got, that'll tell you what
mm.
kind of gems are in that sort of
Wow.
grit or gravel. And it was the most terrifying thing I ever did was go down this gem mine. It was like the working conditions were absolutely horrific.
Oh, I
I
bet.
mean, it was literally just a crawl space that you could barely move in. It's being propped up by sticks. You're on the same level of
Mm,
the river, so at any moment, if you put a hole in the wall, it could flood. The tunnel can flood, and they're just working with candlelight down there. And he was
wow.
mostly mining. He was doing sapphires and moonstone.
A lot of sapphire coming out of Sri Lanka, and sapphire is the stone that I think a lot of Jyotishis have the biggest caution about, in the lineage I'm sitting in included. In fact, some of my teachers have said even yellow sapphire, which most people consider to be for Jupiter, I've had some caution from my teachers around yellow sapphire. They consider it to still have some Saturnian influence, even though it's yellow, and they recommend yellow topaz as a primary for Jupiter for that reason. I have to say, I tried out a yellow sapphire, and it did not have the expected Jupiterian effect. It provoked a lot of anxiety in me, and it seemed to be more along the lines of what I would have expected from a Saturn stone. So my very limited experimentation seems to bear that out. I find that, well, first of all, Saturn is, of course, always looms large. And whether somebody's in Sadhisati or Saturn Dasha or a major Saturn transit, it's like at least 50% of the time, Saturn is always a major player in a chart. And at least 50% of the time, whatever the person's coming for has a lot to do with Saturn, I would say. So I'll tend to recommend Saturn Upaya. And I think because of Saturn's nature being more austere and more severe, I'll usually recommend some sort of, like if it were a Jupiter Upaya, I wouldn't necessarily recommend something that's an austerity where you have to give something up, but Saturn is much more like, I liken him to he's like this slow and steady ox cart. And if you're not paying attention, you're going to get dragged behind the cart. It's kind of like, take some steps to keep up with the ox cart so you can have a more pleasant walk and not get dragged. You're gonna get there one way or the other, but it's nicer to do it on your own on
Mm.
your own 2 feet. And so, I think um, austerity for Saturn can be a very helpful thing of sort of, it's like there's no shortcut upayas for Saturn. You kind of have to show up and do the work. And
Mm.
I'm in Sadhusati right now, and I've just kind of structure my Saturdays around Saturn, and I kind of I do my best to walk that walk, and then when I offer that to people, it's coming from a place of like, this is really something you can do with your life. Get up, say a Saturn mantra or a Saturn prayer, do some sort of simple Saturn puja, the ritual nod, maybe put on your blue shirt or something like that, at least as a, partly as a nod to Saturn and as a reminder to yourself of, oh, that's what I'm doing today, right? I'm dedicating part of my day to this energy, this planetary force who looms large in my life. And then some kind of service work or austerity fasting sort of thing. It doesn't have to be complete fast, but if you eat meat, maybe giving that up for the day, or if you're already vegetarian, maybe you're a vegan for the day, or maybe you don't eat till sundown, or something where you figure out what you're willing to commit to, and then you do it. So I try to put several pieces together into kind of it's like several little vectors that all point at the same direction and add up to hopefully more than the sum of their parts.
Mm.
I don't know. I've been on that program for a couple of years, and I found it to be very, very helpful in terms of getting some slack, getting some slack in the line between me and that cart. And I've actually come to enjoy the Saturdays a lot. They've become a very crucial part of my week and of my life of like, yep, it's a very particular vibe, but I'm just leaning into it, and it seems to be working.
Mm. Yeah, there's
Yeah.
almost something a bit. I think it's kind of good. I mean, they say it's the other way around. It's better to have a Saturn dasher later in life, but I always think it's kind of probably better to have it early. I'd rather get all that out the way rather than and have Saturn compound with old age as well. Somehow if you're younger, you've got some spring and you can bounce back from it a bit rather than getting a Saturn dasher when you're already elderly and it kind of compounds all those Saturnian qualities.
Yeah, pros and cons, I guess. I mean, Saturn is going to shape you and mold you profoundly, and that can be, at the end of the day, it can be a gift. It's not necessarily a pleasant process, but
Mm,
hopefully you're in better shape at the end of it in some respects. Of course, it depends on the details of the chart and what hat Saturn is wearing and all of that.
mm. Just take us through a very quick appraisal. So somebody's coming in, you give them the birth time, you've drawn up the chart, or the screen's got the chart there. So what are your kind of like hot points that you're looking for? What's the kind of have you got like a system that you use to quickly sort of apprehend what you're looking at?
Number of different lenses that I'll look through. First of all, I guess I try to let the chart speak to me. I mean, there's certain rubrics we can look through and different tools we can apply, but I try not to be too rigid about that. I want to see what is this chart saying to me. I try to kind of let it speak on some level and get an impression from the chart. But certainly one thing I've been, trained to look at is what my teacher would call utilization. What is the strength of the Lagnesha, the Lagna Lord? Because that really determines to what extent the person is going to be able to kind of make use of the opportunities that come in their life, turn the lemons into lemonade, that sort of thing, have the strength of character to not be a victim of circumstance. So we're always looking for, okay, if the Lugna Lord isn't strong, is its landlord, its dispositor strong? Does it have strength in the divisionals? How can we, we want to find the strength that's there, because if that strength isn't there, it's just a different it doesn't open up as many possibilities for the person. So trying to find the strength, and if that strength isn't really there, that's where upaya can definitely play a role of what's going to support this person and bolster this person so that they can get out of the rut or become less of a victim of circumstance, or that kind of thing. So that just strength of the Lugna Lord is really so central. So that's definitely something I've been trained to look for heavily. Beyond that, there's so many different vicharas, so many different tools we can apply, from yogas to bhava vichara to a million things. Nakshatras are fascinating. Definitely pay attention to that. That's something I'm doing
Mm,
a deeper study of right now, and learning about the marker star for the yogatara for each nakshatra. When placements are close to the yogatara, it just really lights up the nakshatra themes in a different way.
mm.
So
Yeah, I
those
really
can.
like Night Shadow. I mean, they're great. I was really into those when I sort of first started, and but I remember when I wrote the book and I did a section on them, and I was just trying to find all the sort of classic references, and I thought, I started going through the Puranic texts and everything, just trying to find any, and I thought, actually, there's not really a lot written about them. I mean, probably the job that Hart, Defoe, and Robert Svoboda, wasn't it? There was a joint that book, Light on Life. That's probably one of the best goes at a good, concise overview of each nakshatra that I've read. It's a really nice piece. It's not easy to find anything as concise and well written as that. I think the ancient texts are kind of, well, the older texts are more pragmatic and practical. It's practical, isn't it? Like under this nakshatra, it's good to dig a well, or you should not travel, or this is a good nakshatra to hide your money under, and stuff like that. But
There's a good book called The Divine Forces of the Lunar Nakshatras by a woman named Radhe, and she's basically compiled all the relevant info from the Vedas and the Puranas and all the classical sources for each nakshatra. So you'll get, 5 pages of the mythology of Twastri or Vishwakarma for Chitra, for example. Like she's put it together and she's interpreted it and compiled it. So that's a really useful.
they're not new books, are they? They're like 10, 15 years old, or 10, at least 10.
Probably, yeah, I believe so. I had a reading with her, one of my first readings when I was at the Ayurvedic Institute. We were studying Ayurveda together, and even then she was deep into Jyotisha, and only more so since, I think. So she's in
Mm.
a similar lineage. Yeah, I think her books are probably a decade old. She also has a couple of books on Ayurvedic astrology as well.
I'll have a look at, but I haven't actually got a copy of that. But I thought at the time it would be worth looking at it. So there's a decent amount. She's managed to find enough material to write 2 or 3 pages about each one. That's quite an undertaking in
Yeah,
its.
probably 7 or 8. A lot of it is the mythology and the stories of the nakshatra deities, and because there's so much in there. There's so much.
Mm. Yeah, I
It's
found sort of when I was
so
researching it,
fascinating.
there'd be a lot about the first nine are quite, there's quite a luscious amount of material. The second nine is like okay, and then the last nine it was really sparse. You were struggling to find sort of anything really to cobble. So whether that represents a harmonic, the further you move away from number one, the more diffuse they get. I don't know, but that's something I'd noticed when I was kind of putting together a compendium of what they might represent. Difficult things to grasp, nakshatras, but nonetheless interesting.
Yeah, they're so powerful. I mean, when they're resonant. I mean, I've done readings where I hardly mention them, and I've done readings where almost the entire reading is on one nakshatra that's just looms so large for the person. Like I did a reading for somebody who was a Swati person, and we were just talking about wind and Vayu and Vata and kind of the struggle to establish oneself like a little sprout, trying to root down into the earth. And yeah, just all the Swati themes. It was like we talked for 45 minutes about that and then about some other things, but there was so much there, like every point from Swati would like apply to this person, and it was just like couldn't not explore that.
So basically, ascendant lord, some nakshatra work, divisionals, anything. Do you do sort of very specific, like Chandra Lagna? Is that a big thing? Just looking at placements from the moon, or what's the kind of
I will consider it, but mostly for confluence. Like, if something repeats from the moon that's also present from the lugna, we'll give it more weight. I
Mhm.
don't I don't tend to look at the Chandra lugna so much from its own side. Um, I know one can, and it's a valid technique. It hasn't so much been part of, what I've been trained to do so far. I know some people will look at the Dasha Lugna, the Lugna from the Dasha Lord. That's something that I was just exposed to recently. I haven't really played with that much yet.
Mm.
Yeah, there's so much with kind of the standard tools and the yogas and just the looking at what each bhava is doing. The house, the Lord, the karaka, the basics for the bhavas. But it so much depends on what the person is coming for.
Mm.
The chart is like this incredibly information dense crystal or hologram or something like that. And depending on what angle you look through it, you see something completely different.
Mm.
If the person is coming in because they're in a spiritual crisis, completely different things are going to light up in that chart than if it's 10 years later and they're wondering about children. It's so dependent on what's in their consciousness, what's in your consciousness as the Jyotishi. Um, Yeah, I try to be alive to what's important at any given time. Like a Saturn transit could be the big story for somebody, or it could be something completely different. So it's just varies so much. Yeah.
Kind of rounding up a little bit, is there anything we didn't touch upon? I know, did you want to mention something about the other divinationary methods you were using?
Oh, well, I've always been, for the last, I don't know, 15 or 20 years, I've been kind of a nerd for divination styles in general, and I just find it fascinating. And I've kind of thrown all my eggs into the Jyotisha basket of late. But I do find it, I'm somebody who does pay attention to nimitta and omens, for lack of a better word, out there in the world. And sometimes it's useful to, one definition of divination is provoking an omen. That's by a guy, Robert Moss, who wrote a good book on dream work and omens. And I like that spirit. You're saying I can either wait for an omen or I can force an omen to appear. That's what prashna is, or that's what so many forms of divination are, whether you're drawing a tarot card or casting the i-ching. One thing I started playing with along these lines a couple of, I don't know, 4 or 5 years ago, just had fun with, and my wife has really taken to it and has great results with it, is using a random image generating website. So
Okay.
if you Google random image generator, you'll get 5 or 10 different options. The one I
Right.
use is a website called generatormix.com that they have like a random song generator, a random movie generator, and a random this and a random that. But I picked a random image generator, and I just, have my question in mind, and then I'll click generate. And out of everything on the internet, and now also tons of AI generated images, it'll give you an image. And it's like it's kind of like a deck of cards with almost infinite number of cards in it, which allows the creative intelligence of the universe, or whatever you want to call it, to be extremely precise at times and giving you something that's just so funny or so fitting. And I should have come with some prepared examples of this, because I've done this hundreds of times. And sometimes your jaw just drops at the image that you got. You're like, wow, that couldn't be more perfect.
So
You know?
it's taking the image from somewhere and just randomly putting it, or it's taking multiple images and then creating something from those images. Is it?
Well, different random image generating websites may have different algorithms. I don't know how they all work, but this one is pulling an image from somewhere on the internet.
Wow.
And these days, because there's so much AI generated art out there, a lot of the images it pulls will be clearly AI generated images, but I don't think it's doing the generation. It's just finding it through some
Right.
algorithm. Like most forms of divination, it works better when you have some skin in the game. If you're just kind of doing it as a lark with some distance, just to test it or something like that, if you don't put your heart into it and kind of make yourself a little bit vulnerable in the process, it doesn't work very well. But if you have a genuine need to know and you're really looking for some help and you're willing to give it a try, that's where it meets you every time. And you're just like, wow, how did it find the perfect image for, encapsulating so many different aspects of the situation and then suggesting a possible, all in one picture. It's really brilliant, I find.
So are you using that in conjunction with Jyotish, or that's just a separate technique?
That I mostly use. I don't usually. I've occasionally worked with that with a client who'd be open to it, but not very often. That's something I more use for fun, or in my own life. My wife, like I said, my wife, who's a diviner in her own right, through not Jyotisha, more kind of intuitive, and less structured methods. But she's really taken to that and has good results with that. She seems to have a good rapport with it. I've done so many different types of divination. There's a whole kind of a category of divination methods from Africa. Seems to be Central Africa, Southern Africa, part of West Africa, maybe. Sometimes it's called sortilege methods, or it's like bone casting. It's like
Hmm.
the diviner will have like a basket or a box of objects. And this has, so many different tribal groups and ethnic groups in Africa have their own form of this divination. And it's like you'll basically it basically involves taking a handful of objects and putting them onto the mat. It's like, I don't know if the client will grab them, or the diviner will grab them, or somehow you'll end up with a bunch of objects on the mat, and you'll just look at them and explore the spread. It's like, okay, you've got a tin soldier and a bullet and a bone and this and that, and here's the configuration. It's just so rich. You've got a little world that's just opened up. So my wife and I had read a book on that and decided to create our own set. And we don't have a teacher in this. We just kind of, our own interpretation of this style of thing, where we just gathered objects, some little trinket that you had lying around for 15 years, all of a sudden you have a use for it because it goes in the divination set, and a bone that was drying on the kitchen table or something like that. And
Wow, I like
so we
that.
have 75 objects in this box from old pieces of jewelry, and we've given each of them a name, and it has certain associations with it. And when we do this with people, usually we'll kind of both be in the diviner role, and the client will either be one person or a couple. And we don't do this very often because it's such a big process. But when somebody who's close to us or somebody in the community here, sometimes it just feels like it's the right tool to break out, because it feels like it combines divination and upaya kind of in one process, because you end up with they'll reach in and they'll have a.
Is it like Lucky Dip? Do you kind of put it under like some sawdust or some blankets or something so you can't see what you're taking out? Or
In a box or a basket, we tell them not to look. We just have them stick their hand in there, kind of scrabble around, grab a handful of objects. We'll start by opening the space, lighting some incense, making some invocations, kind of creating a sacred space. And then they're reaching in there, they're grabbing their stuff, they're tossing it onto the mat, which itself is a circular thing with different directions marked on it. And then we'll spend we've had to rein it in because at times it went to be a 2.5 hour process, such a deep dive, and it was powerful, but kind of exhausting. So we're like, okay, we can do this in an hour and 15 minutes, we'll limit it. But usually it involves the first half or 2/3 is just exploring what's there and understanding the resonances and drawing out the story, because usually it'll trigger all sorts. It's always resonant with what's going on in the person's life on some level, and you have to explore how. And then once you've kind of got all that out, it's like, okay, how do the pieces need to move? What needs to change on the mat? So it's like starting to actually move some things around is very much akin to like rearranging the psychic furniture as well. It kind of begins the entire process of saying, and it kind of acts as a diagnosis in a sense, not in a medical sense, but in a broader sense of what's going on in your life, where are the traffic jams, and what needs to move. And usually that becomes clear through the process. The process of making some adjustments can actually happen right there on the mat, where you say, okay, this piece that crossed the other one, that I'm realizing what that's about in my life, and I'm going to start right now by lifting that off and moving it, and with the intent also when I leave the mat to make the
you got
relevant
that sort of
change.
two-tiered thing going on as well, because you've got not only got now you've got an object which is materially manifesting a space, it's in a direction, so that changes the energetic as well. And have you got
Right.
aspects in there as well? So like
What I started doing, actually, because I had this kind of directional mat, but at one point I was like, wouldn't it be great to cast this on a Jyotish board? So the last couple times I did this, I just drew up a big North Indian style Jyotish chart. It's not quite as elegant looking as the big woven mat thing that I had, but casting the objects onto the Jyotish chart was actually great, because the 12 houses, and it was a lot clearer in a way. And it reminds me a little. So it's in a way it's not unrelated to Jyotish now. It's kind of those streams have kind of converged somewhat. And it reminds me when I was in Nepal, studying Ayurvedic medicine, I would walk by and there would be these little hole in the wall shops with some sort of Vaidya in there who would be doing tantric work with people, creating amulets, doing little mini exorcisms with a broom, jarfuke stuff, they would call it in Nepal. And they would often have a desk or a table, and in chalk or something like that, they'd have a North Indian style chart drawn. And I would see them throwing rice grains onto it. And I never knew at the time what exactly they were doing, but I think it's some sort of prashna, it's some sort of divination involving, it must involve where's the rice landing on the board, how many grains are landing in the different houses, and interpreting it accordingly. So it's
oh my
it's
god.
actually, I guess I realized what I was doing isn't actually so far afield from the tradition. If you read Prashna Marga, the great South
Yeah.
Indian text on Prashna, there's so many fascinating techniques in there around using. First of all, you're reading what the client brings to the session, what direction they approached from, what is the look on their face, do they move their left arm or their right arm, did the candle go out, so everything is part of the divination.
I was
So
just
it's
about to mention, I got the BV Raman ones, that were done in the 1970s or 80s. I think he redid them. So you got like the book one, book two, and there's a section in there about having the querent light the ghee lamp and then looking at the flame. So, if the flame initially is bright but splutters and dies, it's a project which is initially going to get some traction but will long term fizzle out. Or the opposite, it's a spluttering light to start with, but then it flares and you get a good bright. So yeah, tentative difficulty starting, but ultimately successful. Just things like that, or the direction that the person, like you say, there's so many techniques in there. They're fascinating to read. I mean, I haven't really integrated any of that, but sometimes I'll take note of things if I'm doing an analysis and, like say a bird hits your window or you hear a big bang outside or suddenly the bin men come and empty take away all the rubbish. It's like all these things are kind of like happening around you. They're all reflecting what you're.
Oh, you have to pay attention to that. Absolutely. There's a story from my teacher's teacher or his teacher about a client who came in asking about whether she was going to be able to have a baby. And he hadn't even taken a look at the chart yet, I don't think, from my recollection of the story. But as soon as she asked the question, all of a sudden there was the sound of a loud baby crying outside from somebody pushing a stroller. And he just said, "Yes, don't worry, you'll have a
Good.
baby."
Amazing, isn't it?
Yeah.
Okay, so where do people get hold of you if they want to speak to you more and have you do their chart, or maybe come see you for some Chinese medicine or Ayurvedic? So you've got your other two. Have you got everything on one website now? Have you kind
I have
of?
everything. I put everything on this Kala Mandala website. There's a tab for Chinese medicine, and then the rest of it is devoted to Jyotisha.
Okay.
Yeah, it's kalamandala.com, kalamandala.com. And everything, that's the place to start. Just see what piques your interest on there. Reach out if you're interested in a reading of any kind or a divination of some sort. Chinese medicine work is also possible remotely. Obviously acupuncture. I don't have a flying needle technique that can go. I can do herbal consults at least with anybody in the States and often further afield as well. So that's all possible. Jyotish readings, of course, can be non-local. It's great to sit with somebody face to face if they're happen to be in this neck of the woods. But I live in a pretty rural, remote part of North Carolina, so it's
Okay.
mostly remote work with the Jyotisha.
Okay, and obviously your Substack Seeds from the World Tree. If people are interested, that's you're kind of. I think I probably get something every week pops through. So you're pretty prolific on that. You're writing all the time, lots of interesting things to look at, and obviously subscribe to as well. That's great. Yeah. So just basically, was there anything else that I didn't mention that you wanted to say, or did we pretty much cover everything? I can't.
Well, I think that pretty well covers it, Andrew. I mean, there's plenty more we could nerd out about, from gemstones to this or that, but I think that's a good stopping place for today.
Okay, well, on that note, we'll finish up. So, thank you very much, Jonathan. Thank you for coming back and speaking, and yeah, hopefully talk to you again in the near future.
Pleasure, Andrew.